Have you ever stopped to think about whether you're really in control of your choices? I mean, really? Well, there's this fascinating theory in psychology that says maybe not so much. The idea is that pretty much everything we do is just a learned response to the world around us. It's called behaviorism, and it basically says our environment is the ultimate architect of who we are.
Yeah, it really boils down to that classic debate, right? Nature versus nurture. Are we just born a certain way, or does our environment mold us into who we become? While behaviorism doesn't mess around, it takes a really firm stance and says when it comes to our actions, nurture is absolutely king. All right, so let's get into it. What is behaviorism really? Well, you have to imagine a time when psychology was all about, interpreting dreams and trying to figure out these hidden, mysterious thoughts. And then along come the behaviorists with this totally radical idea. They basically said, hey, let's stop guessing what's going on inside the mind, the black box, and let's just focus on what we can actually see and measure. And that's our behavior. So the core idea here is super simple, but also kind of mind-blowing. It's that everything we do, seriously, everything from your morning coffee habit to your deepest fears, is learned. We learn it all through interacting with the world. The whole goal was to make psychology a real hard science, something you could actually observe and measure objectively. And what can you measure? Actions. So if you look at it this way, our actions aren't just random. They're not being driven by some mysterious force inside of us. Nope, they're just learned responses. We're reacting to all the little cues and consequences we face every single day. It's almost like we're in this constant feedback loop with our environment.
Okay, so where did this whole idea even come from? Well, funny enough, it didn't start with a psychologist at all. It actually started with a biologist, a guy named Ivan Pavlov, and a famously slobbery experiment.
And what's so wild about this is that Pavlov wasn't even trying to study psychology. He was researching digestion in dogs, but he started to notice this really weird thing. The dogs would begin to salivate just at the sight of the lab assistant who brought them their food before they even saw or smelled any food. It was a total accident, but that one little observation, it changed everything.
So this observation led him to his big, famous experiment on what we now call classical conditioning. And it's actually pretty straightforward. Okay, step one. Before you do anything, you've got a natural trigger, right? The food. And it causes a natural response, the dog's drool. Simple. Then, step two, Pavlov started ringing a bell, a totally neutral sound, right before he gave the dogs the food. He just kept doing it. Bell, food, over and over. And then step three, after a while, the dog started to connect the dots. They learned that the bell meant food was coming. So pretty soon, just the sound of the bell was enough to make them start salivating. That neutral sound had become a brand new, learned trigger. Okay, so Pavlov proved this works with automatic stuff in dogs, like drooling. But what about people? What about us? Could the same idea apply to something way more complex, like human emotions? Well, there was an American psychologist, John B. Watson, who was absolutely determined to find out.
Yeah, that was the big question. Watson had this really bold belief that even our deepest feelings, we're talking fear, love, the whole range, were just conditioned responses. And to prove his point, he designed what is now a very infamous experiment to see if he could actually teach a baby to feel fear. So he worked with a baby who we now know as little Albert. And at first, Albert had no fear of a little white rat. It was just a fluffy, neutral thing to him. But then Watson would show Albert the rat, and at the same time he'd make a super loud, scary noise right behind the baby's head. He only had to do this a few times, and soon enough, just seeing the white rat, with no noise at all, was enough to make little Albert cry and show fear. He had learned to be afraid of it. It's a powerful demonstration for sure, but also for very obvious reasons, a kind of experiment that is completely unethical and would never, ever be allowed today. So, classical conditioning is great for explaining those automatic, knee-jerk reactions, but what about the choices we actually make, our voluntary actions? Well, this is where B.F. Skinner comes in. He really took behaviorism to the next level. He argued that the real key to understanding our behavior isn't what happens before we act, but what happens after.
Skinner called his big idea operant conditioning. And honestly, the logic is so simple, but it's also really profound. Basically, our voluntary actions are controlled by what happens right after we do them. If you do something and a good thing happens as a result, guess what? You're probably going to do it again. If a bad thing happens, you're less likely to repeat it. It is all about the outcome.
And Skinner broke this whole thing down into 4 types of consequences. Let's say you want to increase a behavior. Well, you can add something good. That's positive reinforcement. Think of praising a kid for cleaning their room. Or you can take away something bad. That's negative reinforcement. That's like your car finally stopping that annoying seatbelt beeping once you buckle up. Now, if you want to decrease a behavior, you can add something bad, which is positive punishment, like getting a scolding. Or you can take away something good, negative punishment, like losing your phone privileges.
But Skinner didn't think it was just about this simple learning process. He saw our behavior as this complex interaction between 3 big levels of influence. So first, you've got our biology, the genetic stuff we inherit as a species. Then second, there's our own personal history, every single reward and punishment that has ever happened to you in your life. And third, there's our culture, all those shared rules and social norms in our community that guide what we're supposed to do.
So, why does any of this matter? What's the big takeaway here? Well, when you look at these 3 pioneers, Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner, you can really see this powerful idea evolving. It's this structured way of explaining why we do the things we do, and it's all based on how we interact with the world around us.
So let's just break down that evolution real quick. You had Pavlov, who showed us how triggers before an action can create these automatic learned responses. But then Skinner, he completely shifted the focus. He showed how it's the consequences after an action that really determine if we're going to do it again. And that shift from what comes before to what comes after, that's really the heart of how this idea grew.
When you boil it all down, the big message from behaviorism is this. Our behavior isn't some big mystery. It's learned. What we do every day is pretty much the logical result of a whole lifetime of interacting with our environment, being shaped by associations, by rewards, and by punishments.
So I want to leave you with a final thought. Just take a look at your own life for a second. Think about your daily habits, your biggest successes, even your struggles, and ask yourself how much of who you are and what you do is really just shaped by that constant stream of rewards and consequences all around you.